Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. This is a tutorial on how to use two-point perspective to create 3D text that looks like it's coming out of the paper. I've used this technique for loads of my artwork in the past. This is a few examples. Some of these are in 3-point perspective, but a lot are in 2-point perspective. I'm going to keep this one simple for now. Just to show the basic technique of using 2-point perspective. So you'll need some paper, obviously, a pencil, an eraser, a fine line technical pen and a ruler, preferably a clear ruler. I usually use a hard pencil like a 3H or a 6H pencil to do my line work, because the graphite's harder, it doesn't blunt so easily. You get longer use out of the pencil before you have to sharpen it, and also it's the shading is much lighter with a harder pencil, and you have a bit more control over your darker areas and your lighter areas, rather than going in with like a 2B pencil, which is instantly quite dark, and then you have to start rubbing stuff out or whatever. So I use a 6H or a 3H sometimes, and I'm using a Micron 0.05 fine technical pen, and I use that for my outlines, and that just means that I can outline the work once I've done it, and I can get rid of the construction lines and all the rest of it and leave me with just the lines that I want. And then I like to use this type of eraser. I think this one's made by Derwent, but you can train the edges into quite a nice point, and that gives you a nice edge to erase stuff without erasing stuff you don't want to. You can use a putty rubber, but I find that they're just a bit too soft and they can smudge on certain types of paper. Normally I wouldn't use this type of technical pen, but as this is an HB and it's the leads are retractable, so they stay nice and sharp constantly, I'm going to use this one so that you can see my pencil work a bit better. I don't think the 6H will come out on video very well, so that's why I'm using this one. Okay, let's get started. So the first thing you want to do is draw a horizontal line, and this is your horizon line. So you can put this in different positions depending on how you want to look at the object that you're drawing. I'm going to have another tutorial that outlines different places you can put the horizon line depending on how you want your final drawing to look. But for now I'm putting it near the top, and this means I'll be looking down on the thing that I'm drawing. So then you want to create two vanishing points towards the end of your horizon line, and all the lines from the sides of your drawing are all going to converge to either one of these points, and that will give you the perspective, and the as things get smaller as they go into the distance. So now what I'm going to do is draw the area on the floor where my lettering is going to sit. So I want this line to go through my vanishing point. So I'm putting a little bit of a gap in there, and the word I'm doing is up. So that was my U, and this is going to be my P. So these are the two sort of footprints of my two letters. So now I'm just marking in where I want to put my U. All the lines that are on a certain plane, they all go back to that vanishing point. So there's my U. And now this is going to be my P. Just zoom that in so now you can see. So now I'm going to start rounding off the edges of my U, and I just do this freehand. And the same with my P. I'm going to erase all this pencil work later, so you can feel free to get it just how you want it. And now I'm going to put the verticals in. So as this 2-point perspective, everything in the left and right planes are going to go to the vanishing points, but the verticals are just parallel. In 3-point perspective, you would have another point at the bottom of this that would give you perspective in the up and down direction as well. So I've just set a height there that I like, and now I'm going to draw a box that gives me a height for all of these letters. So my verticals are all parallel, I'm just checking that there. And then I'm going to reference off of the points that I've just created to give me perspective. So that's given me a height for my letters. So now what I want to do is extend all the edges of my letters up so that I can then recreate that word on the top plane. So I've got the ground plane and I want to create it on the top plane as well. And what happens as you do this, you create intersections and reference points above that you can then connect to your vanishing points, and that's going to give you geometry at the top that you can start following to create the word on this higher plane. And what I like about this type of stuff is there's a certain amount of artisticness to it, but it's also quite technical, and there's you know if you've got something right or wrong because it just doesn't look right. So you don't have to sit there wondering whether you're doing it right or not. It's fairly obvious when you've got it wrong, and I like that. So now I'm going to use my fine line technical pen to outline this, and that means that I can then get rid of all of this messy construction lines. And I'm deliberately going very, very lightly because I don't really want the ink to be obvious in my final piece. I just want to be able to put some lines down that I know are going to withstand the erasing and leave behind. Actually, what I do is I usually erase over these lines quite hard, and that takes some of the black ink out, and it actually looks more like pencil at the end. Right, so that's all my inking done. So now I'm going to rub out these construction lines. So although those construction lines won't be in my final piece, and it's a lot of work to sort of get to that point, I know that visually it works and that it's going to be realistic in the end. And that's why I do the 2-point perspective and go to those lengths, because it's all about that realism, really. So now what I'm going to do is start to add tonal values to the text itself. So I'm going to imagine that I've got a light source somewhere. You have to decide where that's going to be, based on where you want your shadows to fall and where you want your light to be. I've picked mine in the top right corner, and I'm going to start to think about where the light's hitting, and what faces are going to be a similar tone. So in my mind I'm thinking, okay, everything that points in one direction is going to be one colour, one tone. Everything that points in a different direction to the light is going to be a different tone. So I'm starting with the darkest faces. These are the faces that are facing away from the light, so they're going to be darkest. And what I like to do is do one pass with the pencil quite lightly, and then I'll assess the tone and add more pencil if I want it. And often I'll do this once, and then once I've done all of the tonal values, I'll go back in and darken some areas just to make it pop, or just to create that difference. So I'm continuing to do the darker faces, all the faces that are facing away from the light at this point. All those surfaces that are flat will have a pretty similar tone. But obviously on this P there's a curved surface, and so the angle from the light is changing as it goes round that curve. So I'll have to think about making it darker or lighter depending on what angle that particular surface is to the light. And this is quite important in terms of making the thing look realistic. And using tonal values is a really good way of suggesting the form of something. So here I want it dark just where I'm shading here, but as it comes back round it's being hit by the light a bit more. And actually on the far right of that P is almost direct light, and so that I'm not going to shade that at all. That's that area there. So now I'm doing these lighter areas. And I'm constantly checking that the faces that are pointing in the same direction are all the same tone. See, this area here is almost facing away from the light, so that's going to be very dark, and gradually it's going to get lighter as it comes round. Right, so that's my tonal values done. And I like to go in at this point with an eraser and just get rid of any overshoots that I've done. And this is a different eraser I use with the even finer point. And that means I can just knock out those little overshoots and without going into the stuff that I want to keep. Now what I want to do is start to produce the shadows that the form is casting. And the letters themselves, they'll cast a shadow onto the floor, but they'll also cast a shadow onto themselves. So at the moment I'm just doing the floor shadow. So because I know the angle of my light, I get a feel for where that shadow is going to be cast at what point off the curve of that P. And so now this is giving me a reference point so that I know where it casts the shadow onto the letter itself. So I draw a faint line there, and I'm going to put the shadow in onto the P itself. So the P is casting a shadow onto the ground and also onto itself. And once you start putting these shadows in, it really starts to come to life. Your eye, wants to see it as a solid object at this point. When I put the shadow values in slowly and just build them up, and I can take the angle that I've just created there and I can repeat it in the other places where it exists. There is a way to calculate exactly where shadows will fall. I'll put that in another tutorial, I think, because it's quite in depth. But for this one, I'm just guessing where the shadows are falling. I think that's good enough for something like this. When you start getting into really complex pieces, or if you decide that your light source is quite a harsh light, then it will create very strong shadows with very defined edges. Then you need to start calculating exactly where they are. But for this one, I've decided that the light is going to be quite soft, so the edges of the shadows are not very well defined, and that means I can get away with guessing where they go. And by going slowly, I can sort of bring them out or bring them in as I wish. If you set your light source very low, then the shadows will be long. And if you set your light source very high, then the shadows will be short. And that's like the shadows that you'd get in the evening when the sun is low, versus the shadows at midday when the sun is right above your head. And as all these angles and tonal values are consistent with one another, the more you add that's consistent with the rest of the piece, the more it ties together as a whole and the more realistic it looks. So now I'm just using an eraser to shape my shadow. And now I'm adding a cast shadow that the P is casting onto the U. And it always pays to keep your eye out when you're out and about or at home or wherever when you have light sources, and just study the way that light and shadow work in reality, depending on different light sources and their positions and how close things are to other things and how light behaves. Once you start doing this kind of stuff, you tend to start looking about at things and wondering about why light is doing that and why there's shade there and all the rest of it. Quite interested in penumbra, like in a shopping centre where you have lots of different lights all competing with one another. You get lots of different shadows overlapping. You get some really interesting shapes and shadows and stuff. So now I'm just going over what I've done just to kind of make it pop and darken areas that I don't think are dark enough. And so that's pretty much it. Now one little trick I like to do is on a curved surface, I like to just knock out a little bit of the shadow, and that tends to give it a little bit of a gleam. So now I'm going to draw some lines that are going to suggest that this is sitting on a rectangular surface, and I'm going to do that with my vanishing points so that the surface that it sits on is also in the same perspective as the text itself. And then my plan is to cut around that. You can do this with a craft knife or a scalpel. For very detailed pieces, you'll certainly want a craft knife. And this is where the thing really pops off the page, really. So there you have it. This is sitting up off the surface a little bit, so you're getting the shadow behind there, which is not ideal. So I just stuck this down, and there you go. So there you go, thanks for watching. If there's anything unclear in this tutorial, let me know, and hit me up in the comments, and if there's anything else you'd like to see, let me know. Alright, cheers.